So hi everyone. Thank you guys for coming tonight. We're excited to have the conversation with you guys. And so how just the event is going to go tonight. So I'm going to read an excerpt. Abdul and I are going to have a conversation for briefly, and then I'll just actually just take the mic. That might be easier. Abdul and I will have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to you guys, and we can all, ask questions, discuss. That sound good to everyone? Awesome. Thank you guys again for being here.
To be fair, you don't have a choice.
Is that good for you?
Yeah, you know what? I'll just grab it. Perfect. Better? Great. All right. So with Brian's book and this topic specifically on education, diversity, and equity, social justice, it's so many things that have to do with education. It's not just education. People think that when you talk about education, you're talking about specifically the information you're receiving in school, but it's so much more than that. There are systemic things at play that have been at the forefront of the educational systems that we need to change. We're dealing with symptoms instead of getting to root causes. So if we can change not necessarily the narrative we're putting out, but changing the way we think about putting out the narrative. If we can change that and effectively influence the way we distribute that information, that's where I think we have more of an impact. So getting into that, we will then talk about, I guess, first how I got involved with this whole thing, and then we'll go from there. So I met Brian like 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
Yeah, 2 years
I think
ago.
about 3 years ago at a random chance through our good friend Adam, who is doing video for us, who you can't see. But basically, we created this friendship out of nowhere and basically started from the topic of education. We just had a conversation, started talking, realized that we both had mutual experiences growing up when it comes to the way we, as part of a specific demographic, have been taught education and how we have perceived the education and assimilated that over time. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of looking at all of the things that weren't taught to us, that we found out way later, that we really should have been taught at an earlier age, which we'll address later. But after having multiple conversations about this topic, we realized that we have a lot in common from besides of our shared experiences, our thought processes, and the way that we approach education is very similar. So it was a no-brainer when after Brian had finished his book and we got to talking and realized that because we had so many similarities, he asked me to join in and write the foreword for his book, which I'm very honored to do. And I will get that to you soon. So because of that, I ended up getting involved in the book because of the importance that we both felt that we needed to share these stories and our shared stories as people, as individuals, but also as a demographic and also as a citizen of this country and as a citizen of the world, because it's not only here that these systemic issues take place. Social justice is a worldwide living entity that we need to address and really put effort into. Because without the effort, then it just gets thrown to the wayside because there are so many important issues to tackle. But education does, if you change the way you enter education, what you take away, then a lot of the other issues end up going away. So if you start with education and change it at an earlier age, you can deal with racism, you can deal with social injustice, you can deal with social inequities, you can deal with just capitalistic inequities. All of these things slowly over time, when you deal with education, you then change people's mindsets, which then allows you to change society itself. Mm-hmm. So that's why I got involved with the book, but I'll pass it off to you as to why you wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, so really for me, as Abdul mentioned, just through my lived experiences as a Black man growing up in South Carolina and attending public school throughout my childhood and then going into college, I consistently noticed through my own educational experiences as a child, but then also when I became an adult and started working in education, just the through line of, just to be frank, a lot of the inherent inequities, inherent racism that is perpetuated within our educational system. And so it was actually so I'd always said I was going to write a book, but then in 2020, of course, when everything shut down, our lives were disrupted. And then, of course, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd sent our nation into really starting to look at systems and structures within our country, more specifically the criminal justice system, and really start to be critical and think about and call out some of the inherent racism that is in that criminal justice system. That when that was happening, and I felt like as a country, we were so quick to call out our criminal justice system. I was thinking of myself as an educator and someone who has experienced education and education is a thing that every American unites all of us, right? We've all experienced it. I was saying, well, we were quick to look at the issues with the structures of our criminal justice system, but we don't necessarily talk about our educational system and the inherent issues within our educational system in the same way. And from working in education and also, experiencing education, I just felt like there was a story that needed to be told that had not yet been told. And so that was the impetus for me writing this book. And that led me on the journey to have me sitting in front of you all here today and in front of you all on camera. So that is how that began.
Great. So I'm going to start off with essentially the reason of legacy. So when we talk about legacy specifically within liberation, I have my own with being a relative of Harriet, but more importantly, so we all have this legacy of liberation, either within us or just around us. So for me, thinking of education and thinking of liberation specifically, the two go hand in hand because years ago, or to say 150 years ago, liberation was more of a physical embodiment of getting to the freedom land, specifically slavery and enslavement, and having to physically move north. Now, this is just more of a personal take, but I take liberation today as educational based because now we've done the part of freeing the people. Now we have to free the minds. So for me, I think that's the next logical step, hence why I feel education is so important because you need to free people's minds, changing mindsets, and in that way we now illuminate the rest. The best way to put it is from the Black Panthers. Their 10-point plan, specifically the fifth point on their 10-point plan was the educational advocacy. Specifically is that they want education, or I'm going to quote it, so we want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. We believe in an educational system that we will give to our people a knowledge of self. If a man does not know or have knowledge of himself and his position in society and the world, then he has little chance to relate to anything else. So when we talk about our shared lived experiences of education in this country, that is a great embodiment of the sentiment, because if you, as a young minority in this country, and you're not told your proper history, you don't have a sense of self. You don't have a sense of who you are. And if you don't have that, how do you as an individual and as a society then grow and move forward? Because if, the old saying is if you don't know where you've been, you won't know where you're going to go. So that directly correlates to a situation of this educational system that we have inherently created. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to read an excerpt from his book that translates into some of this as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
So right now, I'm going to read an excerpt from my from the third chapter in my book, well, currently right now, the third chapter in my book. And the chapter is entitled, I Hate You. And so this chapter, just to give some context around the excerpt, this chapter is me going through my elementary school experiences. And the end of the chapter, the excerpt that I'm going to read is at the end of the chapter, and it's actually like a summation or a summary of my reflections on my elementary school experience and how it impacted me and impacted those around me. So I will begin the excerpt. Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your heads to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? These words, directed to an audience of hundreds of Black people, loudly came from Malcolm X's mouth during a speech at the funeral of Ronald Stokes in May of 1962 in Los Angeles, California. Before saying these words, he condemned the United States for their lack of school integration, though the Supreme Court ruling on Brown v. Board of Education happened 8 years prior. He went on to say, who taught you to hate the race that you belong to, so much so that you don't want to be around each other? I have listened to that speech many times and have reflected on Malcolm's question, who taught you to hate yourself? As I think about my elementary school experience, I believe it was a breeding ground for the hatred that Malcolm spoke of. Though I had experienced the consequences of systemic racism in our American society before entering elementary school, my time there cultivated, developed, and normalized the hatred. From the mistreatment of Black and brown students in my classrooms, to the hatred Black boys had for me and I for them, to the lack of positive liberatory teaching of Black history and Black contributions to the United States, to the academic tracking that once again segregated students by race beginning in 4th grade, to discriminatory comments made by teachers, all of these elements taught hate. They taught the Black student to hate who they were and to see themselves as less in a society built on their oppression. They taught Black students that they were second-class citizens in schools meant to educate them. They taught them that being around one another was not a positive circumstance, but rather a negative one. They taught that suppression was the only way to survive. So, if I had the privilege to be in the audience on that day in Los Angeles in 1962 and respond to Malcolm's question, who taught you to hate yourself? I would answer that our American schools are one of the biggest teachers of self-hatred to Black and brown people in this country. And in my experience, it begins early in the elementary school. I would go on to argue that in any good lesson, you should be able to see the outcomes of what was taught. And by looking at the state of Black students based on statistics, by the time they enter middle school, the lesson in self-hatred is one of the best our educational system teaches. Are we having some speaker issues?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, no problem. But that's the end of the excerpt, guys.
When did you write that?
When did I write this? When I began writing the book, so maybe like a year ago, something like that, yeah.
But it was about an experience.
Yep, yeah, so it was about my elementary school experiences, yeah.
So you're talking, I don't know, so I'm too old to remember. What, 8, 9, 10?
Yeah, about
8, 9, 10, yeah. And so, but also too, so thank you for your question. But we'll have time at the end where everyone will be able to ask questions because I want to make sure Abdul gets his questions to me first, but then we'll open it up at the end where everyone will be able to ask questions. But yeah.
that is a very, very
yeah.
valid question.
Yeah.
Though. Yeah. But it is going to be addressed because it's actually in here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So some of the things you noted in your excerpt are direct things that resounded with me a lot. Specifically when it comes to not necessarily hating myself, but growing up, we talk about desegregation, and what you find in the American educational system is that segregation still exists. It's just a different form.
Yeah.
So a lot of people think that segregation is just a matter of, okay, Black people over here, Black and brown people over here, white people over here.
Yeah.
But in the educational system, once you hit 4th or 5th grade, when you start doing the standardized tests, which if you don't know the history of standardized tests, they are racist in their inception. But when you look at standardized testing today, what happens then is you get filtered out. So you get kids who, not to put it bluntly, but you get kids like us who were put into the advanced classes. You talk white. So essentially you just speak eloquently or you have good vocabulary. But it's a lot of these microaggressions that we have to deal with and have to take on and burden ourselves with at an early age while not knowing what it means or understanding what's actually happening to us, which then gets explained when you're 35 or 34. So it's now unpacking our entire lives into a book or talks like these to now understand that the evolution of these systematic racist or however else you want to view them, segregational ties, when you deal with these microaggressions, it's how to unpack that and how we deal with it and move forward. So that that's exactly ties into what you were talking about, and that is the shared experience that as a Black or brown person that we have to deal with. So once you get put into these advanced classes, you then get, as you put it, viewed by your peers who are also Black and brown, who then start having microaggressions towards ourselves. So you get the questions of, how come you're not hanging out with us anymore? Why are you always with your white friends? Or are you with you're excelling so quickly? But those aren't really the questions. Those are just the symptoms of the fact that we're now being segregated from our own peers because we don't relate to them anymore. And that becomes a burden and a problem because now you have issues throughout the system where I'm no longer with other kids who look like me. I'm now with other kids who are just excelling or doing well or following along with what the teaching program is supposed to be. So you then have all of these issues. So, which is, I guess, to put it, it would be an educational segregation at this point. So I guess through that, can you reflect on your vulnerability and our shared story? Because a lot of things do resonate with me as well. As to, while sharing your experience, could you talk about why you feel it's important to speak about challenges within the educational system as an educational advocate?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if there are any teachers here in the room or people who work in education. There might be, yeah. Wave to teachers. Shout out to all the teachers in the room. Yes,
Nice.
yes. So we know as educators, we are inundated with data, right? Especially when it comes to demographic data and the academic disparities, behavioral disparities, all of those things. And we're inundated with that data and then asked to address that data. But I think underneath that data is the lived experience of all of those students, right? And the lived experience of those teachers, right? And so for me, why it was so important to share and talking about a book about writing a book about education and race and how we change and transform it, it was important for me to be able to tell a powerful story or give that shared lived experience that so many students face and so many educators experience as well. Because that, I personally feel, I believe deeply in the power of storytelling. And I think that we are emotional beings, whether we want to be logical, whether we say we're not, we're emotional beings. And emotion moves us. And for us to, and the things that Abdul and I are talking about right now, the things that I talk about in my book, it's not anything new, right? These are decades, century-long issues. And I think the way that we pave a path forward is really starting to unearth those stories, unearth that lived experience of all of us, and to humanize that experience so that we can then see ourselves in it, and then it would inspire us to act towards change. And so sharing the vulnerability of my own story in this book, as well as talking about the statistics and the things that we always see and always hear about, was really important because I think the story piece is essential to actually inspiring us to action. So.
Perfect. So one thing that you did mention in your excerpt was about psychological warfare. So I think that is potentially going to be either a controversial aspect because a lot of people don't, when you think of psychological warfare, you think of actual war, propaganda, things like that. But when we talk about psychological warfare, it's a very different thing and it's very subtle. So if you don't mind just touching on that and how that relates to this conversation and how you believe psychological warfare is happening in our current system.
Yeah. So I don't think I actually, in the excerpt, I didn't use the term psychological warfare, but in the book, when the book comes out and everyone reads it, I will use that term. I do use that term in the book. And so first, before we even get into why I'm talking about psychological warfare, I want to norm us on what the definition of psychological warfare is, right? And so one definition of psychological warfare is things that are done to make someone, such as an enemy or an opponent, become less confident or to feel hopeless, afraid, etc. And so when I think about the educational experience and when I think about the various demographics, specifically speaking from my experience as a Black male and other Black males like me, but I think this runs the gamut of many children, non-white children in our educational experience. Oftentimes, the way that education is presented to us, especially in the early years around the history and culture, or the lack of acknowledgement of history and culture, is, as Abdul put it, a subtle way to build a hierarchy in someone's mind. And actually, this idea of psychological warfare, though it may be controversial in the book, it is not a new idea. So today is, well, yesterday, 68 years ago from yesterday, Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark court case that all of us know that led to desegregation of schools in the United States happened. So 68 years and a day today, that happened. One of the big reasons that case and they won that case and desegregation happened was through a study that was done by a couple called Kenneth and Mamie Clark, and they did the doll test. And I feel like a lot of people probably, I see some heads nodding, are familiar with that doll test. And so what that doll test was essentially they had young children, preschool, kindergarten age, look at dolls, Black and white dolls, and had them, and they prompted them and asked them questions about the dolls, like which doll is better, which doll would you like to play with, and et cetera, things like that. And without fail, across all races, there was a propensity towards anti-Blackness. So none of the kids wanted to play with the Black doll. They disliked the Black doll. They disregarded the Black doll, and everyone felt as though the white dolls were better to play with, better to interact with. And so, like I said, that study was done in the 40s, and that study was used to show as an argument that the psychological warfare that was happening in our school systems during the time of segregation, right? And that was used to advocate for integration. Fast forward to 70 plus years later, that study has been done consistently throughout the years with the same results, right? So now schools are more integrated. Still, there are definitely some schools, the school that I taught in was 99% Black and brown kids, so there are still definitely segregated schools. But schools are now more integrated, though the results of that study, the research study or procedure of the doll test still remains the same. And so, to me, I think it speaks to a bigger issue, right? Segregation, I think, at the time was a symptom of the racism or the inherent racial caste system that we had perpetuated within our educational system. And I think the integration still did not address the root cause of that inherent racial caste system that our educational system is perpetuating. And so I think that is why you're continuing to get the same results from that doll test when you do it with little children, because still that psychological warfare, and it's subtle. And no teacher is going in and saying like, oh, I want to, have psychological warfare against kids. No principal, I perpetuated that psychological warfare as a teacher. We all do, because it's a system. And so the psychological warfare is there. It's based on how we teach history, the history that we choose not to teach, the cultures that we choose not to address, and the way that we perpetuate this racial, social hierarchy in our society, and we do it every day in our classrooms. And so, yeah.
Got it. So the last question that I have, at least that's on our docket, and then we open up to you guys, is to go off of that and talking about specifically liberatory education, which I don't think we haven't named it, but you have talked about it. So I'd love for you to talk about what liberatory education means and what liberation in the history in the schools has been like, specifically for Black and brown children. And if you could first just explain what it means and then how it's referenced today.
Yeah, so when I talk about liberatory education, actually the term, my first introduction to the term, and I feel like a lot of people's introduction to the term, came from a gentleman named Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and in that he talks about liberatory education. And when he mentions liberatory education, and when I speak of liberatory education, it is educating children in the social political context of the society that they live in, right? And so that means when you're teaching history, when you're teaching whatever subjects, you are teaching it in the social, political, economic context, the society that these children are living in, so that they can begin to, it raises the consciousness of the children to be critical thinkers of their society, to challenge the status quo, right? Like, you're not teaching history just for rote memory. You're presenting a historical fact, and then you're asking them to, well, is this, like, what do we think about this? Like, is there another story to this? What is the perspective of this person, the loser's perspective? How do they feel, right? And so it's really building that critical consciousness that is necessary for you to challenge your society, to question the society, and actually to liberate you out of the confines that a society and the education of that society might perpetuate, right? And so when I speak about liberatory education, that's what I mean. And I also just want to touch on the importance of teaching in the context of the student, the context that the students are in. And so in cognitive psychology, there's this term called active learning. And it is one of the best ways that someone can learn, and it's how we acquire information. And so that is when, let's say you have a new idea, and a new idea is presented to you, and active learn that new idea is you take that new information and you connect it to a pre-existing concept that you have in your mind, right? And so when we think about that, and Abdul brought up standardized testing, when we think about a test question that could ask, oh, when Brian goes skiing down the slope and he starts at 50 feet and then ends at 30 feet. What's the feet in between, right? But if I've never skied, I never went skiing, I don't know what skiing is, no one around me has ever gone skiing, this new information that's being presented to me, I don't have a schema in my head to connect it to, right? So already I'm at a disadvantage to the student that has that, right? And so that's why that's a part of the liberation of education, is having the social political context of the students that you're educating to be a part of the education that you're teaching them, because they're able to actively learn and gain those new concepts and then begin to really raise their consciousness and their intellectual ability as they're acquiring new information, and then begin, again, like I mentioned, to challenge and ask those critical questions needed to be thriving citizens in our society. And so I think that is it for our questions. So now I'd love to open it up to everyone here. And I'm hoping that this is resonating with people.
Indeed.
Thank you, guys.
Adam.
Adam.
Yes. Can you tell us a story of like an early childhood memory that impacted who you are and maybe even helped prompt you to write the book?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, why don't I do this? I'll just read an excerpt read an excerpt of the story. So one of the earliest memories that I have, and I talk about it in the first chapter of my book. And so the first chapter of my book actually starts pre me entering into school, right? And I start the first chapter of my book asking, what does a child learn about themselves before entering into school? And because, again, based on this social political context and based on the Clark doll test that I mentioned before, these are young kids when they're seeing the dolls, right? So they have a wealth of experiences that are already happening to them that is starting to shape how they see themselves in society, who they are in society, and what they think about others in society, right? Racial identity and gender identity and all of the identities start to develop very early. So anyway, I start the book with that question, and I start the book with one of my earliest memories that I have, and it's actually a memory of me visiting my parent, my dad. He was in jail, and I was 3 years old. And I recount that experience and the impact that it had on me because as I was visiting him, and went into the visitation room, and there was like a glass partition, of course, with the phone, and my mom and my grandma were there, and we were walking through, and I was like, of course, 3, so I'm like nervous, right? And the fact that I can even remember it means of just how jarring of an experience it was, right? Like, because at 3 years old, many people don't remember things at 3, and I don't remember the rest of my 3-year-old years except probably that experience, right? And so when I got into the visitation room and I saw my dad on the other side of the glass partition, and mind you, as any little kid, you would imagine, like, their dad is their hero, right? Like, this is the person that they emulate, especially for a young boy. Like, this is the person who you see yourself as. He's the bigger version of you. And so I walk in, I see my dad behind the glass, and I describe it in the book as he seemed powerless, right? And as my mom and my grandma were talking to my dad, I was a 3-year-old, so I was just looking around, just looking around. And there was a line of glass partitions next to my dad's glass partition. And behind every glass partition, there was a black man. And so for me, as a young black boy, right, who already is seeing his dad behind the glass partition, but then to see everyone else behind that glass partition is someone who looks like me, an older version of me, what do you think that is starting to do to my psychology, right? And who I am in society and where I can go in society. And then mind you, too, I have memory, all the officers, the corrections officers or the police officers in there did not look like me and did not look like those guys behind the glass, right? And so that is just a part of that psychological impact and the psychological warfare that begins to happen. And it starts early, but then it's perpetuated once you begin and you move through school, right? And and then the same message is continued. And so that is, and Adam, to your point, that I think in many ways set me on my journey, right, for equity and all that, is that earliest memory and that earliest experience.
I'm just going to ask a question.
Yeah,
Okay.
of course,
Please.
Mark.
Can people hear me? It's fine. Also, there are people on the video, right? So
Yes.
if they ask questions, is there a way to delay them? You may know that.
It's actually just a live stream.
It's a live stream.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's a one-way window.
All right.
Yeah.
So, we actually have some people here tonight from the Stamford Advocate, some people
Awesome.
from the paper in Stamford, and we had invited the mayor of Stamford here too. In the letter to both of them, I pointed out something that's pretty important from a recent census.
Yeah.
I just want to read it to everyone and get your thoughts.
Do you want the mic?
So, according to a recent census,
Mark. Here.
Mark, yeah, use the mic. Yeah.
Just use it because it's probably going to be a good question.
So according to a recent census, half of the racial makeup of Stanford is non-white,
consisting of 14.1% Black or African American, 0.3% American Indian or Alaska Native, 8.6% Asian American, 3.2% from 2 or more races, and 27.2% Hispanic or Latino or of any race. And there's estimated to be over 31,000 families living in Stamford. And the Stamford public school system is an integrated district with racial balance requirements exceeding those of the state. So state requirements in Connecticut require that a school's racial makeup be within 25% of the community's racial makeup. Stanford's standard is 10%. So therefore, Stanford schools are unbalanced.
Yeah.
I feel like Brian's gonna have, you both will have a lot of thoughts about this, but as an educator and someone who's worked with the Department of Education, how do we fix this problem? Where's the root of it, and what do we do?
Yeah. And so, Mark, I just want to clarify. Then, what's the percentage breakdown again? 10%.
The minimum requirement to have a diversity at a school in Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, is at least 25% of the school needs to be non-white.
I got it.
Stanford is below that at 10%. So there's already an imbalance.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty severe imbalance.
Yeah. So a lot of times, and many of us are familiar with, at this point, I feel like we've talked about it a lot as a society, how schools become segregated, right, based on neighborhoods and where people live, and of course, and then schools in poor neighborhoods are underfunded because it's based on property tax, and so we all understand that. And so I think New York City, especially during my time there, has really advocated for more integration of schools. And I know a lot of districts are doing that. And I think one of the ways that you begin doing that is you have to be pretty explicit in wanting that. Because I think naturally, sometimes it's not going to happen based on just how neighborhood lines are drawn, based on how schools are placed and people's perceptions of schools, what's a good school, what's not a good school. And so as district leaders and as principals and district leaders, you have to be very explicit and sometimes doing rezoning efforts, right, to increase that percentage of diverse students in your particular school. And then as on the ground, as a principal and as educators in that school, the recruitment efforts, right? Like going to the neighborhoods that you might not go to, or the neighborhoods that are close to the school, but a lot of kids from those neighborhoods don't necessarily come to those schools. And then too, so it's one thing getting the kids in the school, but then it's another thing, what I talked about a lot here, and I talk a lot about in the book, is when the kids get into school, what's their experience, right? And so oftentimes they're integrate the schools, but then when you get in the schools, it's a horrible experience for those who have been integrated in that school, right? Because the school's not ready to receive them. The educators are not ready to receive them. And the other students aren't ready to receive them. And so I think that also lends itself to making sure that you have the cultural competency to meet the needs of all the students within your school, right? So we're not continuing to perpetuate the psychological warfare that is happening. So so I think it is one, being intentional about the zoning and where students are placed. I think it is also being intentional about recruitment efforts and going into those communities that you might not necessarily have gone in before to bring those students in. And then also, once the students are there, making sure those students feel welcomed and have the ability to thrive while being there. And so that 10% could mean a series of those things, but it could also be that maybe non-white students don't want to go to those schools, right? Or don't want to attend a particular school because their families and the student experience might be one that is not particularly welcoming. right? And so it could be a series of things. And so, Abdul, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Actually, I am that.
There you go. So,
So for my example, which is how, weirdly enough, so what a lot of people don't know is that Mark and I were childhood friends. So we knew each other when we were like 5 and 6 and 7 until I moved away because of this issue. So no, it wasn't Mark.
Mark, we're looking at you. We're looking at you, Mark.
It's all his fault. It's 7 years old.
He was not welcoming to Abdul.
No, my mom actually has very fond memories of him. But no, but to speak to that is, so I grew up originally when I moved from Africa to the States, I lived in Scarsdale first, which Scarsdale is essentially, a village that is very similar to Greenwich. It's very high class, it's very upper class, and if you are essentially non-white, it makes your life very, very difficult to assimilate. So growing up, I didn't have the best experience. I had a few great friends, but the rest of the population was not. What a lot of people don't know, and probably Mark, you didn't even know this, is that a lot of parents wouldn't let their kids play with me because I was black. So eventually got to a point where I couldn't get play dates. And me being 5, 6, and 7, that's all I want to do is have fun. And because of that, my mom ended up taking me out of a very good school and putting me into, thankfully enough, another good school. But we moved one town over to White Plains. So that's how we ended up in White Plains and us losing touch for like 20 years. So, I am that lived experience.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where you have a community that's, while up and coming or well-to-do, but they're not necessarily equipped to handle other either nationalities or cultures. And you had, from what I remember, there were a handful of Indian families. There was maybe 1 or 2 black families, but the majority of Scarsdale is a white, affluent, it's not a city, it's a village. So, there are a lot of underlying issues in that community that speak to Scarsdale specifically, but those things are everywhere. You have it in Stamford, you have it in Greenwich, you have it in the South, you have it quite literally everywhere. So
Everywhere.
it's, how do you deal with those things? It's either you have to have the community change the way they view themselves and how they view their community, or you have an issue, or you have a situation like me where you get taken out of that school, which is obviously not the ideal situation. You don't want to be pulling kids out, because then not only are you doing damage to the kid by having them uproot themselves and having to then essentially start over in a social hierarchy and relearning yourself, because growing up in Scarsdale, I didn't have a black identity as a child. So I didn't develop one really until high school, because again, educational segregation is what happened to me, because once you hit middle school and you get into 4th, 5th grade, you then start being tracked. And when that happens, you then get split off. So then all of my minority friends, I didn't have classes with them anymore. I had, from my experience, I remember there being 1 black girl in all of my classes, and that was it. So I don't really have black friends, which is crazy to say out loud, but I really don't. My best friend's right over there, and that's it. So it's like, I have a great friends group, but I don't have a lot of,
3 white guys back there?
Yeah, exactly. The 3 white guys are some of my closest friends right there. So, it's one of those things where I don't have a lot of black friends. I do have black friends. I have a few close ones, but I don't have that minority group. So
I'll be your black friend. Abdul.
Yeah, black friends. Oh wait, sorry, that was very white. So you see, but that's the point. Is when you don't have the backgrounds and the people around you, it's very hard for you to understand the problems that are happening around you. To do that. So you have to have discussions like these with people who are open-minded, because you have so many people who are not, which is what's happening right now with the educational system in this country. It is wild, but yet here we are.
And it's not to your point, Mark and Abdul, in the United States, 53% of kids in public schools in the United States are non-white students, right? And so this discussion is, as you mentioned, is happening all over the United States. This discussion is so important because majority of the students in our public schools in this country are non-white students, right? But we are not honoring, and I think that is the best word to use, honoring their experience in schools, and that is having significant impact as we have seen, and as I talk about a lot in the book. And I think Abdul's experience, my experience, and a lot of the experiences of people in the room, they're common experiences because it's a significant problem that's been going on for a while.
I want to ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
And then maybe, I know there's some teachers here, maybe if they wanted to, I don't know, ask questions, it'd be interesting to hear from them.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
You have the mic?
Yeah. So, just to follow up on what you said, you know, when we met when we were childhood friends, and I told Brian this story too. You know, my babysitter was from Jamaica. She made a play date for us,
Right.
right? And she said to me, she said, Mark, you need to be on your best behavior. And I said, why? I'm a good kid. I don't like misbehave. And she said, well, he's a Tubman. You don't understand. And I didn't know at that age because we were very young,
Right.
like 5 years
I
old.
didn't even understand.
Part of how we connected was, I think, I was watching, I think something on the news.
Yeah.
They had put up a statue of Harriet Tubman in White Plains.
Yep.
And there was talk of putting her on the $20 bill, replacing Andrew Jackson.
Yep.
And I think this goes back to what Brian was saying about over 53% of the country, the imbalance in the educational system, not just in Stanford, but in the country.
Mhm.
You know, how much of that is not just sort of like educating kids, but like educating parents? I think
Mhm.
part of that is seeing Harriet Tubman, you know, on the $20 bill, things like that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, it's very true, and that speaks towards representation, which the United States is one of the very few countries that don't have representation on their currency. So, and I don't mean that only specifically for minorities. I mean ADA compliance as well. So when you talk about Braille, you talk about people who have other disabilities that may not be known, you know, physically outright, but that exist. So to talk about the whole Tubman 20 thing, a little bit of a segue, but so the issue with that is that America's currency right now is in default. A lot of people don't know that. So, sorry, default is not the right word. It's not in compliance with its own currency law. So, the United States government was supposed to revamp the 5, the 10, and then the 20. Hence the whole Tubman 20 thing. So that's when it got a lot of press. The woman Barbara, who thankfully enough could get in contact with, who's running that campaign of the Harriet on the 20, which started out as Woman on the 20, she's the one who told me all this. So essentially what's happening is that because the US government, its currency laws are not in compliance with itself, we need to change the physical appearance of the money as well as to put in either Braille or some type of strip or something so that people who are blind can physically touch the money and know the differences of bills. Because right now, if I pull out a 1, 5, or 20, or even 100, you can't tell the difference. The 100 now, because it's got that one strip, you may be able to, but if you get an older 100, you'd never know. So the problem is that you have to do that first. So redesigning all of the bills needs to happen first, and they're doing them in sequence. Hence why the dates keep pushing back, because they keep not doing the ones that needed to be done first. So once you do that, then you can have the others. So that's the reason why Harriet hasn't been put on the 20 yet. There's a backup or a backlog of currency that needs to change. So we need to basically get on board with Canada, the UK, and other nations that are way more advanced with their currency, because right now, I don't remember what the number is, but I think it's every 10 years, the fraud is able to catch up with the currency that currently exists. So if you have a government that is not in compliance with itself, you then have an issue. So the US is already is in default in that aspect, but they're also not in compliance with themselves. So that's what needs to be done for that. But once you have that, to segue back to inclusion, is once you have that representation and people see themselves more and more, then you have more inclusiveness, and then you feel not necessarily, I don't want to say empowered is the right word, but you feel self-respect. You can see yourselves in other places. It's like looking at a sports venue. If you don't see yourself, you can't envision yourself to be that thing. So it comes to the story of, I was just watching something the other day, and he said, why do children love athletes? It's not so much that they love athletes, but they love the idea that an athlete has gone through their whole life and now they're doing the one thing that they absolutely love, and they feel represented by seeing that. So that's why you have so many, as you know, I'm going to just say this, but that's why you have so many African Americans who play football, who play basketball, because they've already seen themselves there. Now you're seeing a lot more African Americans play hockey, because that is a very dominantly white sport. It's a known thing. Skateboarding. You know, there are very specific sports, and if you don't see yourself, you don't envision yourself doing that thing. So seeing people who have gone through an educational system, who have a master's degree, who have a PhD, who are educators, you can then see yourself in those positions to then give yourself that, now you can say that, now you can feel empowered to do those things. So if you don't have that, it's harder to see yourself have that.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah.
So to speak on that, because what you said was very, very true to the core. And one thing that I feel is something that resonates with what you just said is accountability. So what I've noticed just across the country, just from seeing the political atmosphere and the social atmosphere change over the past few years specifically, but I mean, not much has really changed. From what I'm seeing is more of just a veil being lifted. So I think when you have the two dialogues that both of you just shared have to do with empathy and accountability. So essentially empathy on your part and accountability on your part, which are two things that I don't see happening in any way, shape, or form, in all seriousness. Because just look at all the laws that have been passed just in the last year alone. That tells you that one demographic is being favored as children than the others. Because you can't walk into a room or a congressional hearing and say, oh, we're going to protect these kids from hearing all the bad things that we have done. So, because then it's like, why are we protecting some kids from the harshness that has already been done, instead of protecting all of the kids by saying, this is what happened. This is not our future, but this is what happened. And if we acknowledge what has happened and we accept the atrocities, along with the so much good, because as we know within history, specifically in this country, the demographics that have done the most are Black and brown people. And I don't mean that as a juxtaposition, I mean that seriously. Because if you look at anything physical or anything tangible, we've all had a part. And I mean that from everything. Because I'll give you a super simple example, the light bulb. Who's the guy? Thomas Edison. But nobody ever mentions Lewis Latimer. So the problem you have is you have one person who gives all the limelight. Thomas Edison did a wonderful thing, created the light bulb. However, the light bulb did not work long term. It lasted 3 days until Lewis Latimer created the carbon filament, which then made it long lasting. So you can create a thing and get the credit for the thing, regardless if it works, because that's great you've created the thing, but our issue, even with the country today, with all of these topics, is longevity, which you need us, clearly. You know, and it's crazy to say that out loud and say it in the way that I've just said it, but you're right.
We have to start, and I'm
Yes,
Yeah.
Like, we were slaves.
you're not wrong.
Your ancestors literally enslaved us. Like, if you feel a way about that, do something. If
Right?
you feel a way about it, be like, damn, that's fucked up that my ancestors did that. What can I do to help?
Yeah.
Because it was your ancestors that messed with us, and it keeps going.
The
Look
problem,
at the history. If you don't
Yeah.
know, if you don't believe me, look it up.
right?
Look it up.
The problem is the history is being banned.
You hide it, you hide it. I listened to this lady in Ansonia, she found all of this stuff about this black woman in her attic. And I'm like, well, give it to the library. She's like, well, I can't, it's my grandfather's stuff. It's not your stuff. You're a white woman. This is a black family that was millionaires, right? That for a little black girl in Ansonia, she could say, I could be like her. But she can't think that or see that because it's not there, because you think it's yours. And it's not. If we don't understand that if it wasn't for us, y'all wouldn't have America. Like, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Because you made us do your work that you couldn't do. And that's so, again, all this stuff is okay. It doesn't make anybody better. That's the situation that we think that it's causing. It's not. It's let's put the shit on the table and let's build from there. Nobody is trying to be mean and fight you. We know what it is. Now let's do something about it. Let's do
100%.
something about it.
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
too much.
Yeah.
I agree. And I just want to say one thing in response to that, and in response to what Abdul was saying, and then we'll come to a couple more questions. So one, it is the teaching of Black history, but two, it is the expansion of the way that we think about Black history, right? Because I think when we think about, first of all, Black history might not be taught in a school, right? Which that's problematic.
Right.
But when it is taught, it's normally taught in three ways. So we talk about slavery, we talk about the Civil War, and we talk about civil rights. Black history does not start at slavery, right? And so that is, I think, where we fundamentally go wrong, and that is where we continue to perpetuate a social, racial caste system that is our American culture and our American society. Do we talk about the fact that throughout world history, there were Black and indigenous Moorish people who owned white slaves, right? Do kids know that? No.
Definitely not.
Right. People don't know that. And so I think if you tell a more holistic history that is empowering and that it shows the human nature and the powerful nature of all races, and specifically the Black race, to counter the negative perspective that has been happening in our school systems for centuries, then I think that is true teaching of history. That is what, when I talk about the liberatory and liberation history, that is what that looks like. Because it is, one, telling the atrocities, but also telling the triumphs, right? Because I think we never talk about the triumphs. We only talk about the atrocities.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
just super quick before I answer your question, but a lot of people don't realize in world history how far back Black history goes, and then white history happens.
Yeah.
So you can Google this. There was a very great video. I don't remember who it was, but there was an African American historian, and he pulled out a custom, which you can now buy, but it's a custom world history timeline. And when you look at this timeline, he unfolds it, and it's several feet long. And the first few feet is just Black history. Like literally the first few feet, which spans thousands of years. And then you get like Roman history and Greek history. And that's when like civilization for, Europeans really started around that time. We start getting real cities and city-states and things like that. So it's amazing how all of just Black history gets discounted, and then it starts at Roman history. It's like, okay, great, civilization started, even though we had, quite literally the richest man in the world, Mansa Musa,
Right.
who, by the way, is still richer than Jeff Bezos.
The school to prison pipeline is pretty much what happens in school. So not only the design of how the building is, but also how Black and brown kids are disciplined at 10 times higher rates than their white counterparts for these same behaviors, right? Like, so if a white student speaks up in class and a Black student speaks up in class, or speaks out of turn in class rather, the Black student is a lot more likely to get punished than that white student, right? Yeah. So not only is it, as you mentioned, how the kids are controlled, how the school is designed, but it's also how kids are disciplined, and so many kids, as you mentioned, I think you mentioned Maya, the 7th grader who got arrested, right? How crazy is that? A kid getting arrested and already getting into the criminal justice system. And so, and they have cases where preschoolers get arrested, right? Kindergartners get arrested. Their first experience with a police officer is a disciplinary experience. And it's a kid, a little 5-year-old, a 4-year-old, right? And so, to your point, and I'm sorry, I forget your name, the international, Mina, yeah. Amina, yes. Where you said you don't think the system can do it. And yeah, I agree. I think the system currently how it is right now cannot do it. And just a little history lesson when we think about, a lot of people don't know this, but compulsory education, so that means mandated education where we all have to go to school by law, right, in this country. The basis of compulsory education was started in Massachusetts, but the entire United States became a compulsory education nation by the mid-1920s, right? And then they started to push this mandate of kids going to school, because during this time, of course, we were an anti-Black society, so Black people weren't even considered to go to school, but we had a lot of immigrants coming in. And the push for compulsory education was to Americanize the citizens. And guess who was the leading organization to push mandated education in the United States of America? The Ku Klux Klan, right? And so the reason that we have compulsory education and the way that we do it today is because Klan leaders who were leaders across the United States at the time were pushing for it. So if you think about a design of a system, right, and these Klan leaders also were looking through text of what would be in the compulsory education, right? Like, so we talk about this, we don't talk about this, we highlight this history, we don't highlight that history. And so, what'd you say?
Still doing it.
And still doing it, exactly. So if you think about how this idea of the school and mandating school and where we are right now as a society when we think about public education in our nation, and you think about the beginnings of it, beginnings led by the Ku Klux Klan, it's no surprise that we are where we are today.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah.
Of course.
And this is maybe a little off topic, but it's so I'm telling you something I'm dealing with right now as we speak. I'm dealing with fear. I'm gonna tell you why.
Yeah.
So someone who's outspoken, I'm a community activist, I speak out on the truth, I'm an advocate for children. And also, I'm always in the community. I'm always de-escalating problems. You know, I just got a call 2 weeks ago, there was a young man had a gun, whatever. So that being said, right, the way the system is designed, back to what you were saying, we have this thing called the RICO law, right? So when you're Black, right, so I deal with a lot of different people. I'm not gonna stop speaking, I speak to drug dealers.
Right.
I probably spoke to murderers before, I don't know. So if I'm a Black man, I'm walking down the street and I give somebody a handshake and this man is being targeted by the feds, whatever you want to call it, right? So I'm automatically going to go to jail, not knowing what this man does, whatever, and I'm getting a RICO charge. So my question to you is, how come the KKK has to exist for this long and they
without a
never
RICO
taken out
charge?
a big organization as a RICO charge? I never can understand it. They kill, they lynch, they control so much. How come they not considered like an organized crime?
Because,
You just answered your own question.
Yes.
yeah, not only did you answer your own question, but you're forgetting about COINTELPRO, which is, I mean, it's completely off topic, but it's one of the programs started by the FBI. Oh God, I'm blanking on his name. Anslinger? Was it Harry Anslinger? I think it was Harry Anslinger. Anyway, guy at the FBI created a program because he was super racist and was, working with the KKK and other white nationalist leaders. But this man had a vendetta, and so what did he do is he created a bunch of secret programs that still exist today that targets minorities. The FBI used to send MLK, Martin Luther King, letters asking him to kill himself on a weekly basis from the U.S. government. So, it's like, it's those things. So it's like you have a person who's in such a high power position. So why wouldn't you assume, and I mean just saying in general, like why wouldn't you assume that they're not everywhere? So that answers your question. If you can get a person head of the FBI to create secret programs to quite literally spy and advocate against your own citizens. And I mean, I'm not going to even go over to gynecology or medicine or some of the other super atrocities that have been committed by this country against its own citizens, or I'm sorry, against its own property that is now citizens. So you have to frame it in the right way where you tell the whole truth as to the why. And so once you get down to that, then you have your answer, which, I mean, you already answered your own question, but it's a little bit of the history that a lot of people don't know, that these things have happened by our own government.
And I just to add on to that and to close the loop on that conversation about the system not being able to do it and everything that we just talked about here, I think you have to propose, and I do this in the book, a transformation on each level of our society, right? So from a federal, state, local, interpersonal interactions, there has to be a significant radical transformation at each level, right? And I think that's the only way that we can actually pave a path forward. And it's not that it starts top down or bottom up. I think it's happening concurrently, like simultaneously at all levels. And I think that is what we have to advocate for and have to do to actually start to fix this problem that we all know has been centuries long.